Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. The forest was older than anything I'd ever seen, so ancient it felt like it had been forgotten by time itself. Our team of 5 stood on its edge, surrounded by thick, silent trees that seemed to watch us as we prepared to venture inside. Dr. Evelyn Marks led the expedition. She was the type who didn't believe in myths or legends, though the locals had given us plenty of both before we arrived. El Bosque Sangriento, they called it, the Bleeding Forest. I thought it was just a colorful name, like something to scare kids into staying away. Now, standing here with my gear strapped to my back, I wasn't so sure. "Let's get moving," Evelyn said briskly, her boots crunching the dirt as she marched forward. Ryan, the youngest of us, adjusted his glasses nervously. "You don't think there's anything to what they said, do you? About people disappearing?" Evelyn glanced back with a small, patronizing smile. "Superstition thrives where science is scarce. We're here to study biodiversity, not ghost stories." Luis, our botanist, chuckled and clapped Ryan on the shoulder. "Don't worry, kid. Worst thing out here is probably a bear, and we've got bear spray for that." Dana, our tech expert, said nothing as she checked her GPS, her brow furrowing slightly. She wasn't the type to scare easily, but she'd been quiet ever since we arrived. The first step into the forest felt like crossing a threshold into another world. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the canopy above was so dense that only thin shafts of light pierced through. It smelled of damp earth and decay, a rich, almost overpowering aroma that made the air feel heavy. I wasn't a superstitious person, but there was something about the silence that unsettled me. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. Just the sound of our footsteps and the occasional rustling of our gear. "Spooky, huh?" Ryan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Yeah, feels wrong." We set up a base camp in a clearing about 2 miles in. The trees here were massive, their roots twisting and knotting together like veins. Evelyn wasted no time assigning tasks. Ryan and I were to take soil and water samples, while Luis cataloged the flora. Dana set up sensors to measure atmospheric data and monitor wildlife activity. By midday, we'd spread out but stayed within shouting distance. I was kneeling by a stream collecting a vial of murky water when Ryan called out, his voice sharp, "Hey, you guys need to see this!" We regrouped quickly, and Ryan led us to a towering tree with bark so dark it was almost black. It wasn't the color that caught our attention, though. It was the sap. Thick, red, and viscous, it oozed from deep gashes in the bark. It looked like blood. "That's not right," Luis murmured, stepping closer. He reached out to touch it. "Wait," Evelyn snapped, but it was too late. Luis's fingers sank into the sap, and for a moment he froze, his face twisting in revulsion. "It's warm," he said, pulling his hand back. The sap clung to his skin, refusing to drip off. It glistened in the faint light, a deep crimson that seemed to pulse. No one said anything for a moment. Then Evelyn broke the silence. "Take a sample," she said, her voice steady. "We'll analyze it back at the lab." As Luis carefully filled a vial, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Somewhere deep in the forest, a branch snapped, loud as a gunshot. We stayed gathered around the tree for a while, staring at the red sap that seemed alive. Luis had filled a sample vial, but the look on his face told me he wished he hadn't. He kept wiping his fingers on his pants, muttering under his breath. "It won't come off," he said, holding up his hand. The sap clung to his skin in thin streaks, shimmering like wet paint. "Try the stream," Evelyn suggested. She was calm, but her eyes hadn't left the tree. Luis knelt by the water and scrubbed his hands furiously. The sap didn't budge. It smeared and spread, darkening as if burrowing deeper into his skin. "Stop," Evelyn ordered, crouching beside him. She pulled out a bottle of rubbing alcohol from her pack and poured it over his hand. The sap hissed faintly, but stayed put. Louis swore under his breath. "It's like it's alive," Ryan said, his voice barely audible. Evelyn turned sharply. "Don't be ridiculous. It's a natural substance. We'll figure it out back at the lab." But her tone betrayed her. She didn't believe her own words. The forest seemed to grow darker as we continued our work. Evelyn insisted we stick to the plan, so we collected samples, cataloged plants, and made notes. None of us strayed far from the others. The bleeding tree, as we started calling it, was the focal point of our research now. As the hours passed, an oppressive feeling settled over us. The silence was suffocating, the stillness unnatural. Even the faint rustle of wind through the leaves seemed forced, like the forest was holding its breath. Then Dana spoke up. "Did anyone else hear that?" We froze. "Hear what?" Evelyn asked, her voice tight. Dana hesitated, scanning the trees. "I don't know. A sound, like crying." Ryan laughed nervously. "Maybe it's just the wind." "It wasn't the wind," Dana said firmly. We tried to laugh it off, but the tension grew thicker with every passing minute. It didn't help that the sap had started appearing on other trees. Ryan spotted another about 20 yards from the first, and then another beyond that. Soon we were surrounded by them, trees bleeding crimson from gaping wounds in their bark. Evelyn was determined to stay rational. "It's probably a fungal infection or some kind of disease," she said, though her voice wavered. "We've seen similar phenomena in other ecosystems." Luis, however, wasn't listening. He was staring at his hand, now streaked with veins of dark red that seemed to glow faintly under the fading sunlight. "I don't feel right," he muttered. "Maybe you're having a reaction," Evelyn said. "We should head back to camp and monitor your condition." But as we packed up to leave, the forest came alive. A branch snapped in the distance, then another. The sounds were deliberate, like footsteps. The air grew heavy with the smell of rot, and I swear I saw the trees shudder. "We need to leave," Dana said urgently. "Now!" As we started back, the screams began. The screams came from everywhere and nowhere, a chilling, guttural sound that didn't belong to anything human. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the trunks and making it impossible to pinpoint a direction. Ryan froze, his face pale. "That's not an animal, is it?" "No," Evelyn said, though she didn't elaborate. "Keep moving, back to camp." We picked up our pace, the underbrush snapping beneath our boots. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting something to leap out of the shadows. But the forest remained still, its darkened canopy swallowing what little sunlight remained. We stumbled into the clearing where we'd set up camp, but the sight waiting for us wasn't reassuring. The tents were shredded. Our equipment was scattered, some of it broken, as though something had rampaged through in our absence. Evelyn immediately began taking inventory, muttering curses under her breath, but I couldn't take my eyes off the claw marks in the dirt, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by something massive. "Who could have done this?" Dana asked, her voice trembling. "There's no one else out here, right?" Evelyn looked up, her jaw tight. "A bear, maybe, or wolves. Let's secure what we can and keep the fire going. We'll sort this out in the morning." But there was no sorting out the feeling creeping over us. Something was wrong, fundamentally wrong, and we all knew it. Luis sat by the fire, staring at his hand. The sap had spread further, dark veins now crawling up his wrist and into his arm. His breathing was shallow, and sweat dripped down his face despite the cool evening air. "We need to leave," he said suddenly. "Forget the samples, forget everything. We need to get out of here." Evelyn shook her head. "Not at night. The terrain's too dangerous, and without GPS we'll just get lost." "Maybe we're already lost," Ryan muttered. Dana knelt beside Luis, examining his arm. "This isn't just a reaction," she said. "It's spreading. Evelyn, we need to take this seriously." Evelyn rubbed her temples. "We'll monitor him tonight. First thing in the morning, we'll head back to the rendezvous point." But the forest wasn't going to wait until morning. As night fell, the oppressive silence returned. No wind, no insects, nothing but the crackle of the fire. I sat close to the flames, gripping a stick like it would do me any good if something came at us. Ryan was on watch when he saw the first face. It was in the bark of a tree just beyond the firelight. A face, human-like, but twisted, its mouth open in a silent scream. "Guys," Ryan whispered, his voice shaking, "do you see that?" We turned, and there it was, grotesque and unmistakable. The face seemed to ripple, its features contorting as if alive. Then it disappeared, melting back into the bark as though it had never been there. I'm not crazy, Ryan stammered. I saw it. You're not crazy, Dana said, her voice flat. She pointed to another tree. Because there's another one. The faces were everywhere. The faces were grotesque, shifting and blending into the bark as if the trees themselves were alive. Some of the faces screamed silently, mouths twisted wide in eternal agony, while others seemed to watch us with unblinking, hollow eyes. No, Ryan said, shaking his head. This can't be real. It's some kind of hallucination, right? Tell me I'm hallucinating. Evelyn didn't answer. Her flashlight beam swept across the forest, catching more faces. They stretched up the trunks and down the roots, some so faint they were almost shadows, others so vivid it felt like they might reach out. Dana backed closer to the fire. We need to leave, she said, her voice tight. Screw the samples, screw everything. We're not supposed to be here. Luis groaned, clutching his arm. The red sap had climbed past his elbow now, spreading like veins of molten lava. His breathing grew labored, and his skin was hot to the touch. I can feel them, he whispered. The trees. They're alive. They're watching us. Evelyn grabbed him by the shoulders. Luis, focus. What are you talking about? They're angry, he murmured, his eyes unfocused. We took from them, hurt them, and now they want us. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn released him and turned to the rest of us, her expression hard. We're leaving at first light, she said. No arguments. We'll head straight back to the rendezvous point and call for extraction. Until then, we stay together, stay by the fire, and keep our heads. But the forest had other plans. The faces in the trees seemed to ripple in the flickering firelight, their features growing more defined with each passing minute. The silence was oppressive, so thick it felt like it was pressing against my ears. And then came the first sound, a low creak like wood groaning under pressure. It came from somewhere in the darkness, followed by another and another, until it sounded like a chorus of bending trees. What the hell is that? Ryan asked, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, one of the trees in the distance shuddered violently, its trunk twisting unnaturally. The red sap burst from its bark, splattering onto the ground like arterial spray. Luis screamed, clutching his chest. His body convulsed, and he collapsed onto the dirt. Luis, Dana cried, rushing to his side. His eyes rolled back and his skin turned an ashen gray. The red veins in his arm pulsed, glowing faintly, as if something inside him was alive. Then he stopped moving. Dana knelt over him, shaking his shoulders. Luis, wake up, please! For a moment, nothing happened, and then his body jerked violently, his mouth opening wide in a soundless scream. His eyes snapped open, but they weren't his anymore. They were dark, empty, and hollow. The forest had taken him. Luis's body convulsed on the ground, his limbs twitching as if being controlled by unseen strings. His skin darkened, taking on the rough texture of bark. The red veins pulsed brighter, branching out over his chest and face. Step back, Evelyn barked, pulling Dana away from him. But he's still alive, Dana protested, tears streaming down her face. No, he's not, Evelyn said grimly, her eyes fixed on Luis. That's not him anymore. Luis's head turned toward us with a slow, unnatural motion. His eyes, those hollow, dark voids, seemed to stare right through us. He rose to his feet jerkily, like a puppet on strings, his movements awkward and stiff. Luis? Ryan asked hesitantly, his voice trembling. Luis, or whatever he had become, didn't answer. Instead, he took a staggering step forward. The red sap dripped from his fingers, leaving dark stains on the ground. The firelight reflected off his twisted features, making him look like a walking nightmare. Evelyn grabbed a branch from the fire, the end glowing red hot. Stay back, she warned, holding it out like a weapon. Luis didn't stop. His movements became faster, more fluid, as if he were adjusting to his new form. He lunged at Dana, who screamed and stumbled backward. Evelyn swung the burning branch, striking him across the chest. Luis let out a horrible guttural sound, a mix of a growl and a scream. The sap on his body ignited, flames crawling up his chest and arms. He thrashed violently, the firelight casting monstrous shadows across the trees. For a moment it seemed like the flames would consume him, but then the sap pulsed again, brighter than ever, and the fire snuffed out like a candle. Luis stood there, his body smoldering, the sap dripping from him in thick, glowing streams. "We can't fight this," Dana whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." Evelyn nodded. "Grab what you can carry. We're leaving, now." We scrambled to gather our gear, all the while keeping an eye on Luis. He stood motionless, watching us with those hollow eyes. The faces in the trees seemed to move more now, their features shifting as if mocking us. As we packed up, the forest itself seemed to close in. The trees groaned and creaked, their branches twisting and reaching like skeletal arms. The path we had taken into the clearing was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees. "We're trapped," Ryan said, panic rising in his voice. "No," Evelyn said firmly, though her face was pale. "There's always a way out. We just have to find it." But the forest wasn't going to make it easy. As we started moving, the screams returned, louder this time, closer. They came from every direction, blending into a cacophony of anguish and terror. The ground beneath our feet felt alive, pulsing faintly with every step. And somewhere behind us, Luis followed. The screams followed us, blending with the creaks and groans of the forest. Every step we took felt heavier, like the ground itself was trying to drag us down. Evelyn led the way, gripping her flashlight in one hand and a hunting knife in the other. "Don't look back," she warned, her voice tight, but it was impossible not to. Behind us, Luis, or what was left of him, stalked our group with a slow, deliberate pace. His head twitched unnaturally, his dark eyes gleaming in the faint light. The red sap continued to drip from his body, leaving a trail that seemed to sink into the earth. Ryan was the first to falter. He tripped over a root and fell hard, his flashlight clattering to the ground. "Wait!" he cried, scrambling to his feet. We stopped just long enough to pull him up, but the delay cost us. The trees around us began to shift, their trunks groaning as they twisted into new positions. The path we'd been following was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of bark and branches. Dana's breathing quickened. "It's like the forest is alive, it's moving. It is alive," Evelyn said through gritted teeth. "We've seen enough to know that." The ground beneath us vibrated faintly, a rhythmic pulse that matched the red sap oozing from the trees. It wasn't just the forest that was alive, it was aware. As we pressed on, the faces in the trees grew more vivid, their expressions shifting between anguish and rage. Some of the faces seemed familiar, too familiar. I stopped in my tracks when I recognized one. It was Luis, or at least a version of him. His face was etched into the bark of a tree, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. "Evelyn," I said, my voice shaking. "Look." She turned, her flashlight beam landing on the tree. Her face hardened, but she said nothing. "It's not just Luis," Dana whispered, pointing to another tree. "Look at that one." The bark held a new face, one I didn't recognize, a woman with hollow eyes and a look of despair. Nearby, another tree bore the image of a man, his features twisted in agony. "They're people," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The trees are people." "No," Evelyn snapped, though her voice wavered. "They're not people. They're something else. Keep moving." But the forest wasn't going to let us go so easily. The ground beneath us shifted again, and a low, guttural sound rumbled through the air. It wasn't a scream or a groan. It was a voice. "Stay." The word was barely audible, but it stopped us cold. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the trees and into our bones. "Did you hear that?" Ryan asked, his eyes wide with terror. Evelyn nodded, gripping her knife tighter. "Keep moving," she said again, but her voice was barely a whisper. We didn't know where we were going anymore. The forest had swallowed us whole. The forest tightened around us, branches interlocking like the bars of a cage. The air felt heavier with every step, thick with the coppery scent of the red sap. My legs ached, my lungs burned, and yet the ground seemed to pull me forward, like the earth itself wanted to drag us deeper. Luis wasn't following anymore, not directly. Instead, his face appeared in more trees, twisted and contorted in ways that no longer resembled the man he had been. It was as if the forest had claimed him, piece by piece, spreading his image like a grotesque mural. "We're going in circles," Dana said, her voice trembling. "This is the third time we've passed that tree." She pointed to a gnarled trunk, its bark carved with strange, jagged symbols that hadn't been there before. Evelyn glanced at the tree, her jaw tightening. "It's not the same tree," she said, though her tone was unconvincing. "Yes, it is," Dana snapped. "We're trapped. We can't get out." Evelyn rounded on her. "Panicking isn't going to help. We keep moving. That's the only way." Ryan crouched near the base of the tree, running his fingers over the strange carvings. "These weren't here earlier," he murmured. "It's like someone or something marked it after we passed." "Let's not stick around to figure out why," Evelyn said, pulling him to his feet. We trudged on, but the forest's influence was growing stronger. The ground seemed to ripple beneath us like the surface of a living organism. I couldn't shake the sensation that we were walking on something that could feel us, something that wanted us to sink into its depths. Dana stopped abruptly, clutching her head. "I can hear it," she whispered. "Hear what?" Evelyn asked, though the tension in her voice betrayed her own fear. "The trees," Dana said. Her eyes were wide, unfocused. "They're talking, whispering." "Stop it," Evelyn barked. "That's just exhaustion. Don't let your mind play tricks on you." But Dana didn't look convinced. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her temples. Ryan wasn't faring much better. He stumbled along behind us, muttering under his breath. "They're inside," he kept saying. "They're in the air, the ground, they're in me." When he finally collapsed, Evelyn rushed to him, shaking him by the shoulders. "Ryan, snap out of it. We're going to get through this." But Ryan didn't respond. His eyes were glassy, fixed on something we couldn't see. His lips moved, whispering words I couldn't hear. Then, slowly, he raised his hand to his chest where red veins had begun to form beneath his skin. "No," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "No, not you too." Ryan looked up at her, his mouth curving into a faint, eerie smile. "It's already too late," he said. "We belong to it now." And with that, he crumpled to the ground, his body convulsing as the forest began to claim him. Ryan's body writhed on the ground, his skin darkening as the red veins spread like wildfire. Dana screamed, backing away as if she could distance herself from the horror unfolding before us. Evelyn stood frozen, her eyes wide as Ryan let out a choked gasp, his mouth twisting into an unnatural grin before going still. Then he opened his eyes. They were no longer human, just deep, empty voids, reflecting nothing but darkness. His limbs twitched, and his body moved with a jerky, puppet-like motion as he slowly got to his feet. "Run!" Evelyn shouted, snapping us out of our paralysis. We bolted through the trees, the air thick with the sound of creaking branches and groaning wood. The forest seemed alive, twisting and shifting around us as if mocking our desperation. Paths that had been clear moments ago vanished, replaced by walls of bark and gnarled roots. Dana tripped, falling hard onto the ground. I turned back to help her, but she was already scrambling to her feet, her face pale and streaked with tears. "It's not letting us leave," she panted. "It's hurting us." She wasn't wrong. Every direction we turned led us deeper into the maze, the trees closing in tighter and tighter. The faces in the bark became more distinct, more menacing, their mouths forming silent screams as their hollow eyes tracked our movements. "We need to regroup," Evelyn yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Stick together." But the forest had other plans. The ground beneath us began to pulse, rhythmic and steady, like the heartbeat of some ancient, unseen entity. The red sap oozed from more trees now, dripping onto the soil and pooling around our feet. The air grew heavier, suffused with the sickly sweet stench of decay. Suddenly a low, guttural sound rumbled through the woods, a deep, vibrating growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Dana whispered, her voice trembling. "Keep moving," Evelyn commanded, though her own fear was evident. "Don't stop, don't look back." But it was impossible not to. Behind us, Ryan was coming. He moved through the trees with an unsettling speed, his jerky, unnatural gait making him look more like a marionette than a man. His mouth hung open in a twisted grin, and the red sap dripped from his hands, leaving streaks of crimson on every tree he touched. "He's leading it!" Dana cried, pointing at him. "He's leading the forest after us!" Evelyn grabbed Dana's arm and yanked her forward. "It doesn't matter, just run." We broke into a sprint, our boots pounding against the uneven ground. The forest seemed to pulse in time with our frantic steps, its groans and creaks growing louder. Branches reached out like skeletal fingers, snagging on our clothes and packs. I could feel the forest pressing in on me, the weight of it suffocating. My lungs burned, My legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a single chilling thought took root. The forest wasn't letting us leave because we weren't intruders anymore. We were part of it now. The forest's grip on us tightened, its pulsating presence all-encompassing. Every step we took seemed heavier, as if the ground itself wanted to swallow us whole. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were moving in circles, no matter how far we ran. The same trees loomed around us, bleeding red and groaning like they were alive. Evelyn slowed, her breath ragged. She stopped abruptly and turned to face us, her expression grim. "We're not going to find a way out," she said. "Not like this." "What are you saying?" Dana demanded, her voice shaking. "We need to figure out what this forest wants," Evelyn said, gripping her knife tightly. "It's not random. It's keeping us here for a reason." Ryan's voice, if it could still be called his voice, echoed through the woods, distorted and hollow. "You don't belong out there," he said, his tone mocking and strangely melodic. "You belong here. You always have." We turned to see him standing just beyond the tree line, his body half hidden in shadow. The red sap dripped steadily from his fingers, pooling at his feet like blood. Evelyn stepped forward, her knife gleaming in the faint light. "What do you want from us?" she demanded. Ryan tilted his head, his grin widening unnaturally. "It's not about what I want," he said. "It's what the forest wants. It's hungry, and you fed it well." Dana let out a strangled sob, clutching at her temples. "This isn't happening. This isn't real." "It's real," I muttered, my throat dry. "It's all real." The ground beneath us trembled, and the trees groaned louder, their branches twisting toward us like reaching arms. The faces in the bark grew more distinct, their features contorting in expressions of rage and anguish. Evelyn kept her focus on Ryan. "If the forest is alive, then it can be reasoned with," she said, though her voice wavered. "We didn't come here to harm it. We just need to leave." Ryan's hollow eyes glittered with amusement. "You don't understand," he said. "The forest doesn't let go of what belongs to it, and now you do." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The sap on Luis, on Ryan, on the trees, it wasn't just some natural anomaly. It was alive. It was the forest itself, claiming them, assimilating them into its vast ancient network. And now it wanted us. Evelyn's face hardened. "Not without a fight," she muttered, raising her knife. But the forest was faster. The ground split open beneath us, roots surging upward like massive, coiled snakes. Dana screamed as one of them wrapped around her ankle, yanking her to the ground. Evelyn slashed at the roots with her knife, but they just kept coming, relentless and unyielding. "Run!" Evelyn shouted at me. "Go!" But I couldn't leave, not when the forest had made it clear. There was nowhere to go. Evelyn's command to run echoed in my mind, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood frozen, watching as the forest unleashed its wrath. The roots coiled tighter around Dana, dragging her toward the gnarled base of a massive tree. She screamed, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. The red sap bubbled up from the earth, swallowing her hands as if the forest itself was devouring her. "Help me!" she cried, her voice raw with terror. Evelyn slashed wildly at the roots, her blade glinting in the flickering light. For a moment it seemed like she might free Dana, but then the tree shifted. Its bark split open, revealing a hollow cavity filled with writhing, crimson-coated tendrils. They lashed out, pulling Dana inside. Her scream cut off abruptly as the tree sealed itself shut, leaving nothing behind but a faint smear of red. "Dana!" Evelyn shouted, pounding her fists against the tree's bark. But the forest didn't care. The ground shuddered violently, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. The red sap began to seep from the earth around me, spreading like veins through the soil. I tried to scramble away, but the sap clung to my hands, sticky and warm. Evelyn grabbed my arm, yanking me to my feet. "We're not giving up," she said, though her voice was strained with panic. Behind us, Ryan's hollow laughter echoed through the trees. "There's no fighting it," he said, his voice a mix of mockery and pity. "You're already part of it. Just let it happen." Evelyn turned to face him, her knife raised. "Come and get me, you bastard," she shouted. Ryan stepped forward, his movements fluid and unnatural. "You don't need to fight," he said softly. "The forest gives, the forest takes. It's all the same in the end." Before Evelyn could respond, the ground beneath her erupted. A massive root shot up, wrapping around her waist and lifting her into the air. She screamed, slashing at it with her knife, but the blade only glanced off its thick, bark-like surface. I watched in horror as the root tightened, forcing the knife from her hand. Evelyn's cries turned to gasps as the red sap seeped into her skin, spreading like veins of fire. Her body convulsed, and for a moment I thought I saw her face flicker, her features melting into something unrecognizable. "Run," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, but I didn't run. There was nowhere to go. The forest pulsed around me, its groans and creaks growing louder. The faces in the trees stared, their hollow eyes filled with malice and hunger. The red sap climbed higher on my skin, its warmth seeping into my veins. I collapsed to the ground, my vision blurring as the forest closed in. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was Evelyn's face, now part of the nearest tree, her hollow eyes watching me with a look of resigned sorrow. The forest had claimed us all. Hey Reddit, Anna here. I'm a 22-year-old college student, and today I want to share something that happened to me recently. I still can't wrap my head around it, and honestly, I'm not sure if anyone will believe me. But here it goes. So, a little background first. I grew up with two older brothers who were always into tech and hacking stuff. They were the ones who first told me about the dark web. You know, that shadowy part of the internet, where you can find all sorts of weird and creepy things. They always told me to stay away from it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I mean, how dangerous could it really be if I was just looking around, right? One night, after a particularly stressful week of exams, I decided to dive into the dark web. I know it sounds cliché, but I was just looking for something different, something to distract me. I had heard about all sorts of crazy stuff you could find there, from illegal goods to strange services. But what caught my eye that night was an app called Ghost Catch. The app had this old-school pixelated logo of a ghost and claimed it could summon ghosts to your house and even take pictures and videos of them. As someone who never really believed in the supernatural, I thought it was just a dumb gimmick. But the reviews were something else. People were swearing up and down that it worked, that they had experienced things they couldn't explain. Some of them even sounded scared. Naturally, I thought it was all a joke, some elaborate prank to mess with gullible people. So, with my skeptical mind and nothing better to do, I decided to download Ghost Catch. It took a few minutes, but eventually the app was on my phone, its icon staring back at me from the home screen. When I opened it, the interface was surprisingly simple. It asked for permission to access my camera and microphone, which I granted without much thought. Then it had a short tutorial on how to summon a ghost. Basically, I had to turn off all the lights, sit in complete silence, and press a big red button on the screen. It was all very theatrical, but I figured it would make for a funny story to tell my friends later. So, I followed the instructions. I turned off all the lights in my small apartment, sat on my bed, and pressed the button. The screen displayed a countdown from 10, each number accompanied by an eerie chime. When it hit 0, nothing happened. The app just showed a blank screen with a message that said, "Ghost searching. Please wait." I laughed at myself for even thinking something would happen. But then, after a few minutes, I heard it. A faint whisper. I couldn't make out any words, but it was definitely there. I checked my phone to see if the app was playing some kind of audio file, but the screen was still blank. That's when I started to feel uneasy. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. I stood up and turned on the lights, expecting the noises to stop, but they didn't. They just kept getting louder and louder until it was almost deafening. My heart was racing, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. My apartment was silent again. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to process what just happened. My phone chimed, and I looked down to see a notification from Ghost Catch. Ghost detected. Check your gallery for evidence. I opened my photo gallery and there they were. Dozens of pictures and videos that I definitely hadn't taken. They showed my apartment from strange angles, like someone or something had been moving around, documenting everything. In some of the photos, I could see blurry shapes, almost like shadows, but nothing clear enough to make out what they were. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was some kind of elaborate trick or maybe even a virus on my phone. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities and fears. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. My life was about to take a turn for the terrifying, and I couldn't stop it, but that's a story for another part. Hey Reddit, Anna back again. Thanks for all the feedback on part 1. I didn't expect so many people to be interested in my story. It's been a bit cathartic, sharing this experience with all of you. So, here goes part 2. After that first night, I tried to brush off the whole ghost catch incident. I mean, it had to be some kind of prank or bug, right? I considered deleting the app, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see if there was more to it. Maybe I could figure out how the app worked and debunk the whole thing. The next day, I went about my usual routine, classes, studying, hanging out with friends. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, partly because I didn't want them to think I was losing it. But when I got back to my apartment that evening, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. I decided to open the Ghost Catch app again, hoping to find some clues. This time, there was a new option on the main screen, Activity Log. My fingers hesitated over the button for a second before I tapped it. The log showed timestamps of ghost sightings with brief descriptions. Most of them were vague, mentioning cold spots and faint noises. But one entry caught my eye. It was from the previous night, just a few minutes after I had closed the app. Entity captured in living room. View footage. I hesitated, but eventually tapped the entry. A video started playing, showing my darkened living room from the perspective of the phone's camera. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Then, I saw it. A shadowy figure moving across the room, almost gliding. It wasn't clear enough to see any features, but it was definitely there. A chill ran down my spine. I paused the video and rewound it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It had to be a trick of the light or some kind of video manipulation, right? But no matter how many times I watched it, the figure was there, unmistakable. I decided to do some research on the app and the company that made it, but I couldn't find anything concrete. The website was basic, with minimal information, and the app itself didn't have any developer contact details. It was like it had appeared out of nowhere. That night, I couldn't sleep again. Every creak and groan of the apartment felt magnified, and my imagination ran wild. I kept my phone close, watching the screen for any new notifications from the app. Around 3 a.m., just when I was starting to doze off, my phone chimed again. New activity detected. Check your gallery for evidence. My heart pounded as I opened the photo gallery. There were more pictures, similar to the ones from the night before, but this time the shapes were clearer. One image showed what looked like a handprint on the living room window, but it wasn't a normal handprint. The fingers were long and thin, almost skeletal. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This couldn't be real. I decided to call my older brother Jake. He was the one who always got me into tech stuff, and he might know what was going on. I explained everything to him, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake was skeptical at first, but when I sent him the pictures, he went silent for a moment. Anna, that's really weird. It could be some kind of elaborate prank or malware. Let me do some digging. For the next few days, Jake and I tried to figure out what was going on. He couldn't find any obvious signs of a hack, and the app didn't seem to be doing anything malicious beyond the ghost stuff. Meanwhile, the activity in my apartment escalated. Doors would creak open on their own, and I'd hear faint whispers late at night. One evening, I came home to find my apartment in disarray. Books had been knocked off shelves and chairs were overturned. I checked the app's activity log, and it showed multiple entries throughout the day, each describing increased ghost activity. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the list. Jake finally called with some news. "Anna, I've been talking to some people online, and no one's heard of this app before. It's like it doesn't exist outside of your phone. I think you should delete it." I agreed, more than ready to be done with the whole thing. But when I tried to uninstall Ghost Catch, my phone froze. The screen went black, and when it finally rebooted, the app was still there, unchanged. That's when I realized I might be in over my head. Whatever this app was, it had a grip on me, and I wasn't sure how to break free. Little did I know things were about to get even stranger. Hey Reddit, Anna here again. I'm back with part 3 of my story. Thanks for sticking with me through this. Writing it down helps me process everything that's happened, even if it still feels unreal. So, let's pick up where we left off. After failing to uninstall Ghost Catch, I felt more trapped than ever. My apartment, which had always been my safe haven, now felt like a prison. The eerie events continued, and my nerves were on edge constantly. I started avoiding being home alone, spending more time at the library or at friends' places. But eventually, I had to face the reality of my situation. One evening, after a long day of classes and avoiding my apartment, I decided to call my brother Jake again. He could sense the desperation in my voice. "Anna, I've been thinking, maybe we should try a different approach. If we can't remove the app, maybe we can disrupt whatever it's doing. Turn off your phone for a while, or even better, let's do a factory reset." I was hesitant. A factory reset would mean losing all my data, but at this point I was willing to try anything. I backed up my important files and contacts and prepared to reset my phone. As I was about to hit the button, my phone chimed again. "New activity detected. Check your gallery for evidence." Despite my better judgment, I looked. This time there was a short video. The footage was shaky, as if someone, or something, was holding the phone and moving through my apartment. It stopped at my bedroom door, which creaked open slowly. My heart pounded as the camera focused on my bed, where I saw myself sleeping, completely unaware. I dropped the phone, feeling a cold wave of fear wash over me. This wasn't just a trick or a prank. Something had been in my apartment, watching me. Jake, hearing my reaction over the phone, urged me to go stay with him for a while. I didn't need to be told twice. I packed a bag and left my apartment, not looking back. At Jake's place, I finally felt a bit of relief. We decided to leave my phone off for the night and focus on figuring out what to do next. Jake suggested we look into professionals who dealt with paranormal activity, even though he was still skeptical about the whole thing. I didn't have any better ideas, so I agreed. The next day, we started researching local paranormal investigators. It felt surreal, like something out of a bad horror movie, but I was desperate. We found a team that had good reviews and seemed reputable. Jake called them and explained our situation, and they agreed to come over that evening. When the investigators arrived, they brought all sorts of equipment, EMF meters, cameras, and even a thermal imaging device. They listened to my story without judgment, which was a huge relief. They set up their equipment in my apartment while I waited anxiously at Jake's place. A few hours later, they returned with their findings. The lead investigator, a woman named Sarah, looked concerned. "Anna, we definitely picked up some unusual activity. There were cold spots and strange EMF readings, especially in your bedroom. But what's more concerning is that your phone seems to be a focal point. Whatever's happening, it's tied to that app." Sarah suggested we perform a cleansing ritual to try and disrupt the entity's presence. I wasn't sure how much I believed in all of this, but I was willing to try anything at this point. We arranged for them to come back the next day to perform the ritual. That night I stayed at Jake's again, keeping my phone turned off and tucked away. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but at least I wasn't alone. Jake did his best to keep my spirits up, and we talked about anything and everything to distract ourselves. The next day, the investigators returned to my apartment and performed the cleansing ritual. They used sage, chanted incantations, and moved through each room methodically. The whole process took a couple of hours, and when they were done, Sarah seemed hopeful. This should help, but I'd recommend keeping your phone off for a few days just to be safe. I thanked them and returned to Jake's place, feeling a bit more at ease. For the first time in days, I managed to sleep through the night without waking up in a panic. The next few days were uneventful, and I started to believe that the worst was behind me. I kept my phone off and focused on my studies, trying to get back to some semblance of normalcy. But deep down, I knew that I wasn't entirely free of the app's grip. It was just a matter of time before it made its presence known again. Hey Reddit, Anna here again. Thanks for sticking with me. Your support means a lot, and sharing this is helping me process the whole experience. So let's dive into part 4. After a few days of relative peace at Jake's place, I started to believe that the worst was behind me. I kept my phone off as advised and tried to focus on my classes and social life. But the unease never fully left me, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. One afternoon, while I was at the campus library, I ran into an old friend, Lisa. We hadn't seen each other in a while, so we decided to grab coffee and catch up. As we chatted, I mentioned the strange occurrences, leaving out the more supernatural elements to avoid sounding crazy. Lisa, a computer science major with a knack for hacking and all things tech, listened intently. When I mentioned the Ghost Catch app, her eyes widened. Anna, that sounds really familiar. I think I've heard about something like this in a hacking forum I follow. Intrigued, I asked her to tell me more. Lisa explained that a few months back, there were rumors about an app circulating on the dark web. It was said to be able to interact with the supernatural, but most people dismissed it as a hoax. However, a few users claimed it had some kind of advanced AI or experimental code that could manipulate electronics in creepy ways. I felt a chill run down my spine. Could Ghost Catch be that app? Lisa offered to help me investigate further. We went back to her apartment and she started digging through the forum archives. It took a few hours, but eventually she found a thread discussing an app that sounded eerily similar to Ghost Catch. The thread was filled with stories from users who had downloaded the app and experienced strange phenomena. Some described seeing shadows, hearing whispers, and finding bizarre photos on their phones. One post stood out. It was from a user who claimed to have developed the app. The username was Phantom Coder, and they had left detailed explanations about the app's capabilities. According to Phantom Coder, Ghost Catch was an experimental project designed to bridge the gap between technology and the supernatural. They claimed to have embedded a special algorithm into the app that could detect and interact with entities beyond our perception. It sounded like science fiction, but the experiences shared by users were too consistent to ignore. I felt a mix of fear and fascination. On one hand, it was terrifying to think that an app could summon ghosts. On the other hand, I was curious about the technology behind it. Lisa suggested we try to contact Phantom Coder, but the account had been inactive for months. Despite the dead end, Lisa managed to find an email address linked to the account. We decided to send a message, hoping for a response. In the email, we explained my situation and asked for any advice on how to disable the app permanently. Days passed with no reply, and I started to lose hope. Then, one evening, while Jake and I were having dinner, my phone, still off and stored in a drawer, chimed. We both froze, staring at each other in shock. Jake cautiously retrieved the phone and turned it on. There was a new email from Phantom Coder. The message was brief but chilling. Anna, I'm sorry for what you're going through. The app was never meant to be released. It's a prototype and it's dangerous. The algorithm has a way of latching onto its user. Deleting the app won't work. You need to perform a specific ritual to sever the connection. I've attached the instructions. Good luck. Attached to the email was a PDF with detailed steps for the ritual. It involved a combination of chanting specific phrases and using a series of items like candles, salt, and a mirror. It seemed complex and a bit daunting, but if it meant getting rid of Ghost Catch, I was willing to try. That night, Jake and I gathered the required items and followed the instructions to the letter. We set up in my apartment, which still felt cold and unwelcoming. As we performed the ritual, I felt a strange energy in the air, almost like a static charge. We finished the final chant, and for a moment, everything was still. Then my phone lit up with one last notification from Ghost Catch. Connection severed. Relief washed over me. I turned off my phone, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. It was over. Or so I thought. Little did I know the real mystery was just beginning to unravel. Hey Reddit, Anna here with the final part of my story. Thanks for sticking with me through this entire journey. Your support has been incredible. Let's wrap this up. After receiving the email from Phantom Coder and performing the ritual, things seemed to calm down. The app stopped sending notifications and the eerie presence in my apartment felt less oppressive. But despite the apparent success of the ritual, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking just beneath the surface. I spent the next few days trying to regain a sense of normalcy. I kept my phone off, focusing on my classes and spending time with friends. But the nights were the hardest. Every creak of my apartment, every shadow seemed amplified, and I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding. One evening, while having dinner with Jake and Lisa, we discussed the whole situation again. Jake, ever the skeptic, suggested that perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me. Lisa, on the other hand, was more sympathetic, but also practical. Anna, maybe it's time to consider a fresh start. Sometimes the best way to move on is to change your environment. The idea of moving away had crossed my mind before, but I always dismissed it as too drastic. Yet the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. My apartment, once a place of comfort, had become a source of anxiety and fear. No matter how many rituals I performed or how much I tried to rationalize the events, the memories of what had happened lingered. I decided to take the plunge. Over the next few weeks, I searched for new apartments in a different part of the city. It wasn't easy juggling school, the search, and dealing with the aftermath of everything that had happened. But I was determined. Eventually, I found a cozy little place that felt right. It was in a quieter neighborhood, close enough to campus, but far enough to feel like a fresh start. The move was bittersweet. As I packed up my belongings, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and sadness. I was leaving behind a place filled with both good and terrifying memories. But I knew it was the right decision for my mental health and peace of mind. On the day of the move, Jake and Lisa helped me pack and transport everything to the new apartment. It felt like a weight was being lifted off my shoulders with each box we carried out. Once everything was settled in the new place, we celebrated with takeout and a movie, trying to create new positive memories from the start. I decided not to bring the Ghost Catch app or any remnants of it with me. My phone remained off, and I planned to get a new one soon. It was a small price to pay for peace of mind. I wanted to leave that chapter behind completely. The first night in my new apartment was the most peaceful I'd had in weeks. No strange noises, no unsettling shadows, just a quiet, restful sleep. Over the next few days, I started to feel more at home. I decorated the place to my liking, made new routines, and slowly but surely, the anxiety began to fade. I learned a lot from this experience. Curiosity can lead us down dark paths, and sometimes it's best to listen to those nagging doubts. But I also learned the importance of taking control of my environment and making decisions that prioritize my well-being. As for Ghost Catch, I never heard from Phantom Coder again, and the app seemed to vanish into obscurity. It was a strange and disturbing chapter in my life, but I came out of it stronger and more cautious. Thanks for following my story, Reddit. It's been a wild ride, and I appreciate all the support and encouragement from this community. Stay curious, but stay safe. And remember, some mysteries are better left unsolved. I've always been fascinated by the creepy, the weird, and the unexplained. My friends call me a paranormal junkie, and they're not wrong. I spend most of my free time reading ghost stories, exploring abandoned buildings, and watching horror movies. So when I first heard about the dark web, I was intrigued. I knew it was a shady place, full of illegal activities and dangerous people. But the idea that there might be hidden secrets and mysteries to uncover was too tempting to resist. I started off cautiously, browsing through various forums and chat rooms, always careful to stay anonymous and avoid anything that seemed too risky. Most of what I found was either boring or outright disturbing, but one day I stumbled upon a user who caught my attention. His username was Zombie24. Yeah, I know, it sounds cringeworthy, but he seemed different from the usual crowd. His posts were cryptic and full of references to haunted places and supernatural phenomena. After lurking in his threads for a while, I decided to reach out. At first, our conversations were harmless enough, discussing urban legends, sharing creepy experiences, and debating the existence of ghosts. He seemed knowledgeable and passionate about the paranormal, just like me. Over time, I started to feel a strange sense of camaraderie with him, despite the weird username and the fact that I knew nothing about his real identity. One evening, out of the blue, Zombie24 sent me a private message that made my heart race. It contained a set of coordinates and a brief message. Check this place out. It's supposed to be haunted. The coordinates were disturbingly close to my location, just a few miles away from my town. He knew I was addicted to exploring haunted places, and the suggestion was irresistible. I was excited, but also a bit wary. How did he know where I lived? I pushed the thought aside, convincing myself that it was just a coincidence. After all, he had never asked for any personal information, and I had been careful not to reveal anything specific about my whereabouts. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check out the place the next day. The coordinates led to an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It was a typical haunted house cliché: crumbling walls, overgrown yard, and an eerie silence that sent shivers down my spine. I parked my car a little way down the road and approached on foot, my flashlight cutting through the gathering dusk. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood. As I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaked under my weight, and I hesitated for a moment, feeling a sudden wave of unease. But my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I pushed open the front door, which swung open with a loud groan, and stepped inside. The interior was just as dilapidated as the exterior. Dusty furniture, cobwebs in every corner, and the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the empty rooms. I started to explore, my flashlight sweeping across the walls and floor. Every creak and rustle made my heart pound, but there was nothing particularly unusual or supernatural about the place. It was just an old, abandoned house after all. Disappointed, I was about to turn back when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from upstairs. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I strained to listen, but the whispering stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Taking a deep breath, I decided to investigate. I climbed the creaky staircase, each step echoing in the silence. At the top, I found a long hallway with several closed doors. The whispering started again, louder this time, coming from behind the door at the end of the hall. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly. The door creaked open to reveal a small, empty room, but there was something wrong, something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the room was a single chair, and on it, a small, old-fashioned tape recorder. The whispering was coming from the recorder, which was playing on a loop. I stepped closer, my mind racing. Who had left this here? and why? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. Panic set in as I realized what was happening. I had been set up. I grabbed the recorder and bolted out of the house, but it was too late. Police cars skidded to a stop outside, and officers poured out, guns drawn. "Hands in the air, don't move," one of them shouted. I dropped the recorder and raised my hands, my mind spinning with confusion and fear. They arrested me on the spot, not listening to my frantic explanations. As they led me away, I glanced back at the house, my mind still trying to process what had just happened. I spent the next few days in a holding cell, being questioned repeatedly. They thought I was involved in some kind of criminal activity, but I had no idea what they were talking about. Fortunately, I had kept all my online interactions with Zombie 24, and after showing them the messages and proving my innocence, they finally let me go. I was shaken but relieved to be free. However, the experience left me with a deep sense of unease. Who was Zombie 24, and why had he set me up? Was he just a prankster, or was there something more sinister at play? I still don't have all the answers, but I've learned my lesson. This story isn't meant to scare you, but to warn you. Never trust anyone online, and stay far away from the dark web. You never know who might be lurking in the shadows, waiting to pull you into their twisted games. After my release, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboard, every shadow cast by the streetlights outside my window seemed to carry a sinister intent. My once cozy apartment now felt like a trap. I decided to take some time off work to clear my head and, more importantly, to find out who Zombie 24 really was. I started by revisiting my interactions with him. I combed through our chat history, looking for any clues I might have missed. I noticed that most of his messages were vague, filled with eerie references and cryptic hints about haunted locations. But there were a few details that stood out, especially his familiarity with my interests and whereabouts. I decided to dig deeper into the dark web, cautiously navigating the same forums and chat rooms where I had first encountered Zombie 24. It was a tedious and unsettling process. The more I searched, the more I realized how little I actually knew about this hidden part of the internet. It was a labyrinth of secrets, full of people who thrived on anonymity and deception. After days of searching, I found a thread that seemed promising. It was a discussion about local urban legends and haunted places, started by none other than Zombie 24. The thread was filled with eerie stories and accounts of paranormal encounters. But what caught my attention was a comment from another user. They mentioned a specific location, a derelict factory on the outskirts of town that matched the coordinates Zombie 24 had sent me. I decided to visit the factory. I knew it was risky, but I needed answers. I needed to understand why this person had targeted me. I packed a bag with essentials, flashlight, notepad, camera, and a fully charged phone, and headed out just before sunset. The drive was uneventful, but as I approached the factory, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. The factory was a towering, decaying structure, surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. The gate was unlocked, hanging loosely on its hinges. I parked my car out of sight and made my way inside. The air was thick with the smell of mold and rust, and every step echoed ominously in the vast empty space. I wandered through the factory, taking photos and jotting down notes. There were signs of recent activity, footprints in the dust, discarded wrappers, and even some graffiti on the walls. It was clear that people had been here recently, but I saw no sign of anyone else. As I explored deeper, I stumbled upon a small room tucked away at the back of the factory. Inside, I found a makeshift camp. A sleeping bag, some empty cans, and a small flickering laptop. My heart raced as I approached the laptop. It was open to a chat window, and the username on the screen made my blood run cold. Zombie 24. Before I could process what I was seeing, a new message popped up on the screen. "I knew you'd come, you're just as curious as I thought." My hands trembled as I read the message. How had he known I was here? Was he watching me? I quickly looked around, but the room was empty. I hesitated for a moment before typing a response. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The reply was almost immediate. "Think of this as a test, a game, if you will. You love the paranormal, the unexplained. I'm giving you a front row seat." Anger surged through me. This wasn't a game. It was my life he was toying with. "This isn't funny. You set me up. I could have been arrested." The screen remained silent for what felt like an eternity before the next message appeared. "Consider it a warning. You're not the only one who can dig up secrets. Stay out of my way, or next time, it won't be a setup." Chills ran down my spine. This person wasn't just a prankster, they were dangerous. I quickly shut down the laptop and took photos of everything in the room before leaving the factory as quickly as I could. Back in the safety of my apartment, I reviewed the evidence I had gathered. I had proof that Zombie 24 was real and that he had been watching me, but I still didn't know his identity or his true motives. I decided to take my findings to the police, hoping they could use the information to track him down. The officer I spoke with was skeptical at first, but after reviewing the photos and messages, he agreed that there was something suspicious going on. He promised to investigate further and advised me to stay vigilant and avoid any further contact with Zombie 24. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that Zombie 24 was lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next move. I had always been drawn to the paranormal, but this was something else entirely. This was real, and it was terrifying. I spent hours online, researching everything I could about the dark web, cyber stalking, and how to protect myself. I installed security cameras around my apartment, changed all my passwords, and even considered moving to a different city. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the sense of dread that had settled over me. This experience had started as a thrilling adventure into the unknown, but it had quickly turned into a nightmare. And the worst part was, I had no idea how it would end. All I knew was that I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Because Zombie 24 wasn't just a figment of my imagination. He was real, and he was out there, watching, waiting. The days following my discovery at the factory were tense and exhausting. I couldn't shake the paranoia that clung to me like a shadow. Every stranger on the street, every car that seemed to follow me for more than a few blocks, made my heart race. I knew Zombie 24 was out there, and I couldn't predict his next move. One evening, as I was reviewing the footage from my newly installed security cameras, I noticed something odd. At around 2 a.m., a figure had approached my building and stood outside my apartment window for a few minutes before disappearing into the night. The footage was grainy, but it was enough to confirm my fears. I was being watched. I took the footage to the police, and they promised to increase patrols around my neighborhood, but I could tell they were starting to view me as paranoid. I couldn't blame them. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Determined to take control of the situation, I decided to dig deeper into the identity of Zombie 24. If I could find out who he was, maybe I could put an end to this nightmare. I reached out to some friends who were tech-savvy and had experience with cybersecurity. They agreed to help me trace the IP addresses and gather any information they could from the chat logs and forum posts. A week later, they had some results. Zombie 24 was using a series of proxies and VPNs to mask his location, but they managed to find a common point of origin, a small town about 2 hours' drive from my place. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. Armed with this information, I decided to take a drive to the town. I knew it was a risky move, but I was desperate for answers. I needed to know who was behind the username and why they were targeting me. The town itself was small and unremarkable, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was hard to believe that someone so sinister could be hiding in such a quaint setting. I started by visiting local libraries and internet cafes, asking discreet questions, and looking for anyone who might recognize the username or the pattern of behavior. Most people thought I was crazy or brushed me off, but a librarian at the town's public library mentioned something interesting. She recalled a young man who frequently used the library's computers and seemed particularly secretive about his activities. According to her, this young man was a loner, always keeping to himself and never making eye contact with anyone. She hadn't seen him in a few weeks, but his odd behavior had stuck with her. She didn't know his name, but she gave me a description. Tall, lanky, with unkempt hair and a nervous demeanor. With this new piece of the puzzle, I decided to stake out the library, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had. I spent hours in my car, watching people come and go, but there was no sign of the mysterious young man. Just as I was about to give up, I saw someone matching the description walking towards the library entrance. My heart pounded as I watched him. He had the same nervous energy described by the librarian, constantly looking over his shoulder and avoiding eye contact. I waited until he was inside before following him. The library was quiet, and it wasn't hard to keep an eye on him without being noticed. I watched as he logged onto a computer and began typing furiously. I couldn't see what he was doing from my vantage point, but I knew I had to act. I walked over to the librarian's desk and quietly explained the situation, asking if she could find a way to check what he was doing online. She was hesitant, but agreed to help. After a few minutes, she returned, her face pale. "He's on the same forums you mentioned," she whispered. "I think he's Zombie 24. My blood ran cold. This was it. I had found him. But now what? I couldn't just confront him. I needed to find a way to expose him without putting myself in more danger. I decided to wait until he left the library. I followed him at a distance, making sure not to be seen. He walked to a rundown apartment building on the edge of town. I took note of the address and hurried back to my car. I needed to plan my next move carefully. Back at my apartment, I called my tech-savvy friends and explained the situation. They suggested we gather as much evidence as possible and present it to the authorities. They also advised me to stay away from the apartment building until we had a solid plan. The next few days were a blur of planning and preparation. We hacked into the forums and traced more of Zombie 24's activity, gathering enough evidence to build a compelling case. It was a dangerous game, but we were careful, using every precaution to avoid detection. Finally, we had enough. I took everything to the police, presenting them with the evidence and the address of the apartment building. They were surprised by the thoroughness of our investigation and agreed to take action. A week later, I received a call from the police. They had raided the apartment and found the young man, along with enough evidence to confirm he was indeed Zombie 24. He was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including cyberstalking and harassment. The relief I felt was overwhelming. It was finally over. The nightmare that had consumed my life for months had come to an end. But the experience left me with a deep sense of caution. I had learned the hard way that the dark web was no place for thrill seekers like me. It was a realm of shadows and danger, where even the most innocent curiosity could lead to peril. I hope my story serves as a warning. Be careful who you trust online, and never underestimate the lengths to which some people will go to manipulate and harm others. The dark web is a place best left unexplored, and the real world holds enough mysteries without venturing into its depths. After the arrest of Zombie 24, I tried to return to my normal life. It wasn't easy. The experience had left a mark on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I avoided the dark web entirely and stayed away from online forums, focusing instead on my job and spending time with friends and family. But the sense of unease lingered, like a shadow I couldn't escape. A few weeks later, I received a call from Detective Harris. the officer who had handled my case. He informed me that Zombie 24, whose real name was Derek, had agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for a lighter sentence, he had provided information on several other individuals involved in similar activities. The authorities were still investigating, but they believed they had uncovered a network of cyberstalkers who used the dark web to find and torment their victims. It was a small comfort to know that justice was being served, but I couldn't shake the paranoia. I installed even more security measures at my apartment and was constantly looking over my shoulder. My friends tried to reassure me, but the fear was deeply ingrained. One evening, as I was settling in with a book, I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. To my surprise, it was Detective Harris. "Can I come in?" he asked when I opened the door. "I have some updates on your case." I nodded and stepped aside, letting him in. He seemed more serious than usual, which only heightened my anxiety. "We've been digging into Derek's background," he began, taking a seat on the couch. "It turns out he's been involved in this kind of activity for a long time. He was part of an online community that targeted people like you, paranormal enthusiasts, thrill seekers, anyone they thought they could manipulate." I felt a chill run down my spine. "So I was just a game to them?" Harris nodded. "In a way, yes. They enjoyed the thrill of the chase, the power they felt from controlling and terrorizing their victims. But Derek's arrest has helped us identify others in the group, and we're working on tracking them down." "Does that mean it's over?" I asked, my voice trembling. Harris sighed. "We're doing everything we can, but these networks are elusive. There's always a risk, especially with how much information is shared online. But we've taken significant steps to dismantle this particular group." I thanked him for his efforts and promised to stay vigilant. As he left, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The ordeal wasn't entirely behind me, but knowing that the police were actively working to stop these predators gave me some peace of mind. In the following weeks, I focused on rebuilding my sense of normalcy. I reconnected with old friends, took up new hobbies, and even started seeing a therapist to help process the trauma. Slowly but surely, the paranoia began to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism. One day, while cleaning out my email inbox, I came across a message from an unknown sender. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, half expecting it to be another threat. Instead, it was a simple message of support from someone who had read about my story online. They shared their own experience with cyberstalking and offered words of encouragement. It was then that I realized the importance of sharing my story. I had gone through something terrifying, but by speaking out, I could help others avoid similar dangers. I began writing a series of articles about my experience, focusing on the importance of online safety and the risks of the dark web. I even reached out to local schools and community centers, offering to give talks about cyber safety. The response was overwhelming. People thanked me for my bravery, shared their own stories, and offered support. It was cathartic, and I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The dark web had brought fear and uncertainty into my life, but by turning my experience into a lesson for others, I found a way to reclaim my sense of control. Months passed and life gradually returned to normal. I still had moments of anxiety, but they were fewer and farther between. I had learned to be more cautious online, and I made sure to stay connected with supportive friends and family. One evening, as I was preparing for a talk at a local community center, I received a call from Detective Harris. He had good news. The police had made several more arrests, effectively dismantling the cyberstalking network. Derek and his associates would be serving long sentences, and their victims could finally feel a sense of closure. The news was a balm to my soul. The nightmare was finally over. I took a deep breath and smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. As I stepped up to the podium to share my story once more, I felt a renewed sense of hope. My journey had been harrowing, but it had led me to a place of strength and resilience. My story isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is hope. By staying vigilant, seeking help, and supporting one another, we can overcome the shadows that seek to harm us. And most importantly, we can turn our experiences into lessons that protect and empower others. Months turned into a year, and my life finally began to feel normal again. The fear that once gripped me had loosened its hold, replaced by a cautious optimism and a deeper appreciation for the simple joys of everyday life. I continued to share my story, speaking at schools, community centers, and online forums about the dangers of the dark web and the importance of cyber safety. It became a mission, a way to turn my traumatic experience into something positive. One sunny afternoon, as I was preparing for another talk, I received an unexpected email. It was from a major news outlet, interested in featuring my story in a segment about online safety and the hidden dangers of the internet. They wanted to bring more awareness to the issue and believed my experience would resonate with a wide audience. I agreed, hoping that by reaching a larger audience, I could help prevent others from falling into the same traps I had. The interview was nerve-wracking, but the reporter was kind and empathetic, asking thoughtful questions and allowing me to share my story in my own words. When the segment aired, the response was overwhelming. Messages of support and gratitude flooded my inbox, and my social media accounts were filled with people sharing their own experiences and thanking me for my bravery. One message stood out. It was from a young woman named Emily, who had been through a similar ordeal. She described how she had been targeted by someone she met online and how her life had been turned upside down. She thanked me for giving her the courage to speak out and seek help, something she had been too afraid to do before. Emily and I started corresponding regularly, and she became a friend and ally in my mission to raise awareness about online safety. Together, we organized a support group for victims of cyberstalking and online harassment. The group provided a safe space for people to share their stories, seek advice, and find comfort in knowing they were not alone. As the support group grew, so did our impact. We collaborated with local law enforcement, schools, and community organizations to develop educational programs and resources. Our efforts caught the attention of lawmakers, and we were invited to participate in discussions about new legislation to protect individuals from online harassment and cyberstalking. Through it all, I found a sense of purpose that I had never experienced before. The dark web had once been a source of fear and danger, but now it was a reminder of how far I had come and how much good could come from turning a negative experience into a force for positive change. One evening, as I was preparing for a support group meeting, I received another call from Detective Harris. He had more good news. Thanks to the information provided by Derek and the continued efforts of law enforcement, several more cyberstalking rings had been dismantled. The landscape of the dark web was changing, becoming a little less dangerous with each arrest. I thanked him for the update and hung up, feeling a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. The nightmare that had once consumed my life was now a distant memory, replaced by a future filled with hope and purpose. As I walked into the support group meeting, I was greeted by familiar faces and new ones, all united by a shared experience and a desire to make the online world a safer place. We sat in a circle, and I began the meeting with a smile. "Thank you all for being here," I said. "Your bravery and resilience inspire me every day. Together we're making a difference. Remember, no matter how dark things may seem, there is always hope. We are stronger together, and we will continue to fight for a safer, more compassionate world." The room filled with nods and smiles, and I felt a warmth in my heart. My journey had been a difficult one, but it had led me to a place of strength and community. The shadows of the dark web no longer held power over me. Instead, they served as a reminder of the light that can emerge even from the darkest corners of our lives. And so, my story comes to a close, not with fear or regret, but with hope and determination. I had faced my fears, overcome the darkness, and found a new beginning. And in sharing my journey, I hope to help others find their own paths to healing and strength. The dark web may still be out there, but so are we. Vigilant, united, and ready to shine a light on the shadows. I've always been skeptical about the supernatural. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But lately my once peaceful home had turned into a place of unease and dread. It all started with small things, doors creaking open on their own, lights flickering despite new bulbs, and an unsettling chill that hung in the air no matter the temperature outside. I live in a quaint older house with my wife, Emily, and our 2 kids, Jake and Lily. We bought the house because of its charm and character, but recently it felt more like a character from a horror movie. Emily suggested it was just the house settling, but the occurrences were becoming too frequent to ignore. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard footsteps in the hallway. At first I thought it was Jake or Lily, but when I checked, both were sound asleep in their rooms. The next morning, I found our family photo from the living room lying on the floor, its glass frame shattered. The photo was always securely mounted, and I couldn't fathom how it could have fallen. I decided we needed some form of security. After researching various security systems, I was discouraged by the high prices. That's when I stumbled upon a discussion about the dark web on a tech forum. People shared their experiences of buying gadgets at a fraction of the retail cost. Desperate and a bit naive, I decided to delve into this shadowy part of the internet. Navigating the dark web was like stepping into a different world. It was eerie and filled with a sense of foreboding. After a few hours of searching, I found a seller offering high-quality security cameras at a price that seemed too good to be true. The seller had decent reviews, and in my desperation, I decided to take the risk. A week later, the cameras arrived in an unmarked box. They looked new, and I was eager to set them up. I spent the better part of an afternoon installing them around the house. There were cameras in the living room, hallway, kitchen, and each of the bedrooms. That night I felt a sense of relief, thinking we'd finally have answers to the strange occurrences. Reviewing the footage was initially uneventful. The cameras captured our daily lives, the kids playing, Emily cooking, and our mundane routines. But as the days passed, the recordings revealed something unsettling. In the dead of night, the cameras picked up faint, shadowy figures moving through the house. They weren't clear, just wisps of movement that seemed to have no source. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or some glitch in the cameras. But the figures continued to appear, becoming more distinct with each passing night. One particularly chilling recording showed a shadow standing over Jake's bed, its form barely visible but undeniably there. It stayed for what felt like an eternity before vanishing. Terrified, I showed the footage to Emily. She turned pale, her initial skepticism replaced by fear. We agreed not to tell the kids, not wanting to scare them, but we knew we had to do something. I reached out to the seller on the dark web, asking if the cameras could be faulty or hacked. The response I got was brief and unsettling. The cameras are fine, be careful. I spent the next few nights awake, monitoring the live feed from the cameras. The shadows seemed to multiply, their movements more deliberate and menacing. It was clear these were not mere glitches. Something was in our house, something we couldn't explain or understand. Emily and I made the decision to leave. We packed essentials, told the kids we were going on a sudden vacation, and booked the next flight out. As we drove away from the house, I couldn't help but glance back, half expecting to see those shadowy figures watching us. We left the country, settling in a small town where the sun seemed to shine a little brighter. The house is up for sale now, but we haven't had any buyers. I can't bring myself to return, even to retrieve our belongings. The dark web cameras did more than capture our fears. They revealed a reality I never believed in. Despite the terror they brought, I can't help but think they might have saved our lives. But for anyone reading this, stay away from the dark web. Sometimes the price of a bargain is far more than you can afford to pay. Our new home was everything our old one wasn't: modern, bright, and full of life. Emily found a job at a local boutique, and the kids quickly made friends at their new school. We were starting to feel normal again, but the unease from our old house lingered like a dark cloud. One evening, as we settled into our routine, I received an email from the real estate agent handling our old house. Despite several showings, no one seemed interested. The agent mentioned that prospective buyers felt an unwelcoming atmosphere, though she assured me it was probably just the house's age and condition. Life carried on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped whatever was in our old house. Emily noticed my growing paranoia and suggested I see a therapist. I reluctantly agreed, hoping to find some peace of mind. Dr. Foster was a kind elderly man who specialized in trauma and anxiety. During our sessions, he helped me process the fear and confusion that still haunted me. One night, while Emily and the kids were out, I decided to look through the recordings from our old house. I had saved them on an external hard drive before we left. I thought perhaps if I could understand what was happening, I could finally move on. As I watched the footage, the shadows appeared again, but something was different this time. They moved with purpose, almost as if they were searching for something. I fast-forwarded through hours of recordings, watching these figures drift from room to room, night after night. Then, I noticed a pattern. The shadows were most active in the hallway closet, a place I rarely paid attention to when we lived there. A chill ran down my spine. What could be in that closet? Why were they so focused on it? Unable to contain my curiosity, I called Emily and explained my discovery. She was hesitant, but agreed that we needed to investigate. We decided to return to the house during the day, hoping sunlight would offer some protection against whatever lurked there. The next morning, we left the kids with a trusted neighbor and drove back to our old home. The house seemed even more foreboding than I remembered, its windows dark and lifeless. We let ourselves in, the air inside thick with a sense of dread. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. We headed straight for the hallway closet. With trembling hands, I opened the door. Inside, it looked just like any other closet: coats, old shoes, a few boxes. But something felt off. I started pulling out the contents, desperate to find whatever had drawn the shadows. At the back of the closet, behind a stack of boxes, I found a small trapdoor I had never noticed before. It was old and covered in dust, its hinges rusted from years of neglect. Emily and I exchanged a nervous glance, but we both knew we had to see what was inside. I pried open the door, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A musty smell wafted up, and I gagged. We grabbed our flashlights and began our descent, each step echoing ominously in the confined space. The stairs led to a small hidden room. It was empty except for an old wooden chest in the corner. The air was colder down here, and the shadows seemed to cling to the walls. I hesitated, then opened the chest. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs, letters, and trinkets, all covered in a thick layer of dust. The photographs were of a family who lived in the house decades ago. As I sifted through the items, I found a journal belonging to the previous owner. The entries were disturbing. They spoke of strange occurrences, much like the ones we experienced. The last entry mentioned a ritual to communicate with spirits, performed in the very room we stood in. It became clear that whatever haunted our home had been there long before us. The ritual had seemingly opened a door that allowed these entities to cross over. We quickly put everything back, closed the trapdoor, and hurried upstairs, the weight of our discovery pressing heavily on our minds. Back in the daylight, we decided to seal the trapdoor permanently. We called a contractor to help, who, upon seeing the hidden room, paled and worked swiftly. As we drove away from the house for what we hoped was the last time, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief mixed with lingering fear. Returning home, we hugged our kids a little tighter that night. Emily and I agreed to never speak of what we found to them, to protect them from the same fear that had gripped us. But I kept the journal, a reminder of the darkness we had escaped and a warning of the dangers that lurk unseen. Life slowly returned to normal. The unease faded, and I began to sleep through the night again. But sometimes when the house is quiet and the lights are low, I catch a glimpse of a shadow moving just out of sight. and I wonder if we truly left the darkness behind. Months passed, and we settled into our new lives with a sense of normalcy. The terror of our old house felt like a distant memory, though it still lingered in the corners of my mind. Emily and I were careful not to discuss it around the kids, hoping to shield them from the fear that once consumed us. One evening, after a particularly hectic day at work, I decided to unwind by organizing the basement. Amidst the clutter of boxes and old furniture, I found the journal we had taken from the hidden room. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the better of me. Flipping through the pages, I noticed entries I had missed during our first hurried examination. One entry stood out, written in a shaky hand. "They are bound to the house, but they seek to escape. The ritual must never be repeated." I shuddered at the thought. Whatever those shadows were, they were trapped, but by what? A few nights later, as I was preparing for bed, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from a name I didn't recognize. Opening it, I was stunned to see it was from an old friend, Mark, who I hadn't spoken to in years. He had moved away long before we bought the old house, but his message was unnerving. "I heard you lived in the old Simmons place. Did you ever find the hidden room?" My heart raced. How did Mark know about the hidden room? I quickly responded, asking how he knew about it. His reply was almost immediate. "My uncle lived there before he passed. He mentioned the room and some strange occurrences. Be careful." The realization hit me hard. The previous owner's warnings, the shadows, and now Mark's cryptic messages. Everything pointed to something much darker and more sinister than I had imagined. I needed answers. I decided to visit Mark, who now lived a few hours away. Emily was concerned but understood my need for closure. I told her I would be back by the evening and set off early the next morning. Mark greeted me warmly, though his demeanor quickly turned serious when I mentioned the house. Over coffee, he told me his uncle's story. The house had always had a reputation for being off, but it wasn't until Mark's uncle started experiencing the same disturbances we did that he began researching the history of the property. According to Mark's uncle, the house was built on land that once belonged to a recluse named Simon Hargrave. Hargrave was known for his interest in the occult and reportedly conducted various rituals in an attempt to communicate with spirits. The hidden room was his sanctum, a place where he believed he could bridge the gap between our world and the afterlife. Hargrave's experiments grew increasingly dangerous, and the townsfolk began to fear him. One night, a terrible fire broke out, destroying Hargrave's home. His body was never found, and the land was eventually sold and redeveloped, the very land our old house now stood on. Mark's uncle theorized that the shadows were the remnants of Hargrave's failed rituals, bound to the property and seeking release. The ritual described in the journal was Hargrave's final, desperate attempt to control the entities he had unleashed. Driving home, I felt a mix of relief and dread. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the knowledge did little to ease my fears. I realized the shadows might never have left us. They were tied to anyone who came into contact with the house and its dark history. That night, I sat Emily down and explained everything Mark had told me. We needed to protect our family. We decided to perform a cleansing ritual recommended by a local spiritual advisor. It was a simple, family-friendly process involving sage, prayers, and positive energy. It might have been a placebo, but we were willing to try anything. We gathered in the living room, the kids giggling as we lit the sage. As we moved through the house, chanting softly, the air seemed to lighten. The shadows that had loomed over us felt less oppressive. The ritual ended with a prayer for peace and protection, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. The following days were peaceful. The house felt brighter, and the kids' laughter seemed louder, more joyous. Yet I remained vigilant, ever watchful for any sign that the shadows might return. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some papers in my office, I found an old photograph tucked inside a book. It was a picture of Simon Hargrave standing in front of what looked like the old version of our house. His eyes seemed to follow me, a haunting reminder of the dark past we had unearthed. I knew then that while we might have found temporary peace, the shadows of Hargrave's legacy would always linger. We had escaped for now, but the ties that bound us to that house and its history could never be fully severed. We decided to focus on creating new memories, filling our home with light and love. And though the past still haunted my dreams, I knew that as long as we stood together, we could face whatever shadows came our way. Life resumed its comforting rhythm, and the eerie memories of our old house started to fade. Emily, Jake, Lily, and I embraced our new surroundings and poured our energy into making our new house a true home. Yet, every so often, I would find myself thinking about Simon Hargrave and the dark legacy he left behind. One evening, as we were having dinner, Lily mentioned a new friend she had made at school. She described a boy named Timmy, who seemed to know a lot about old houses and spooky stories. My ears perked up when she said Timmy had asked her if our old house was haunted. Trying to keep my tone light, I asked, "What else did Timmy say?" Lily shrugged. He said his grandma told him about a house where ghosts lived, and it sounded like our old one. I told him we moved because of it, and he said his grandma knows all about it. Emily and I exchanged worried glances. I decided to meet Timmy's grandmother, hoping she might have more information about Hargrave and the house's history. The next day, I contacted Timmy's parents and arranged a visit. Mrs. Henderson, Timmy's grandmother, lived in a charming old house on the outskirts of town. She welcomed me warmly and seemed unsurprised when I mentioned our old address. We sat in her cozy living room, and she recounted stories passed down through generations. Simon Hargrave was a troubled man, she began. He was obsessed with the afterlife, convinced he could communicate with spirits. When he disappeared, many believed he had succeeded in crossing over, but others thought he had unleashed something dark. She paused, her eyes distant. My own mother used to say that anyone who lived on that land would be touched by his madness. Strange things have happened to every family that's lived there. Some left quickly, others tried to endure, but none stayed long. Hearing this filled me with a cold dread. Our experiences were not unique. We were just another link in a chain of misfortune tied to that cursed land. Mrs. Henderson handed me an old faded map. This was Simon's property. The current house sits where his study used to be, and the hidden room you found, it's where he performed his rituals. I thanked her and left, my mind racing. The map was detailed, showing not just the house but also the surrounding land and old buildings that no longer existed. That night, I showed Emily the map and relayed Mrs. Henderson's stories. We decided to visit the local historical society to see if they had more information. The historical society was a treasure trove of old records and documents. After explaining our situation to the curator, we were granted access to files about Simon Hargrave and his estate. Emily and I spent hours poring over yellowed papers and brittle photographs. We discovered that Hargrave had been a respected scholar before his descent into obsession. His early work was praised, but as his experiments grew more extreme, he became a recluse, shunned by the community. One document mentioned an incident involving a young girl who claimed to see shadow people in Hargrave's house. She disappeared shortly after her claims, fueling the local legends. Emily found a letter from Hargrave himself, written to a colleague. It was filled with ramblings about binding the spirits and transcending mortal limitations. The most chilling part was the final line. They are restless, seeking freedom. Only through understanding can we control them. The pieces were coming together. The shadows were the spirits Hargrave had summoned and failed to control. They were bound to the land, tied to the rituals he performed in that hidden room. Our presence had disturbed them, but our swift departure had prevented something worse from happening. Feeling a renewed sense of urgency, we decided to return to our old house one last time. This time, we brought along a spiritual advisor recommended by Mrs. Henderson. Father Gabriel was a kind, soft-spoken man with years of experience dealing with the supernatural. As we approached the house, I felt a familiar chill. Father Gabriel performed a thorough cleansing, reciting prayers and using holy water to bless every corner of the property. He assured us that while the shadows might still exist, their influence would be weakened. Before leaving, I buried Hargrave's journal in the backyard, hoping to lay his restless spirit to rest. We sealed the hidden room again, this time with stronger materials, ensuring it would remain undisturbed. Back home, the sense of relief was palpable. We had faced our fears and taken steps to protect ourselves. The children remained blissfully unaware of the true extent of the darkness we had encountered, and we intended to keep it that way. Life returned to normal, and the shadows seemed to recede into the past. But the experience had changed us. We were more cautious, more attuned to the subtle signs of the supernatural. And while we hoped we had seen the last of Hargrave's legacy, we knew that the past has a way of echoing into the present. As the days turned into weeks, the eerie events became nothing more than a whispered memory. We focused on the future, cherishing the light and love we had found. But every so often, in the quiet moments before sleep, I would think about the shadows and wonder if they were truly gone or simply waiting for the right moment to return. Months turned into a year, and our lives had settled into a peaceful routine. The unsettling events of the past seemed like a distant nightmare, one we hoped would never resurface. Our new town felt like a sanctuary, a place where the shadows of Simon Hargrave's dark legacy couldn't reach us. One sunny Saturday morning, we decided to take a family trip to the countryside. Emily packed a picnic and we loaded the kids into the car, eager to spend the day exploring nature and enjoying each other's company. The drive was filled with laughter and music, a stark contrast to the fear that once plagued our lives. We arrived at a picturesque meadow surrounded by tall trees and a gentle stream. It was the perfect spot to relax and forget about our worries. As Jake and Lily chased butterflies, Emily and I spread out the picnic blanket and settled down, soaking in the serene atmosphere. After lunch, we decided to go for a hike along a nearby trail. The path wound through the forest, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, creating a mosaic of light and shadow on the ground. The air was filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers, a refreshing change from the stuffy confines of our old house. As we walked, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The kids ran ahead, their laughter echoing through the trees, and I couldn't help but smile. We were finally free from the darkness that had haunted us. At the top of the trail, we reached a clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. We sat down to rest, and I took a moment to reflect on how far we had come. Emily squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with love and reassurance. We had faced our fears and emerged stronger as a family. That night, back at home, we gathered in the living room for a movie night. Jake and Lily were excited to watch their favorite animated film, and we all snuggled up on the couch, sharing popcorn and laughter. As the credits rolled, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the life we had rebuilt. Just as we were getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the real estate agent handling our old house. With a mix of curiosity and apprehension, I opened it. The subject line read, "Offer accepted." I read the message aloud to Emily. The house had finally been sold. The new owners, a young couple, were thrilled about their purchase and planned to renovate the property. The news was bittersweet. We were glad to be rid of the house, but I couldn't help but worry about the new occupants. Emily and I decided to send a welcome letter, along with a discreet warning about the hidden room and its history. We hoped that sharing our experiences would help them avoid the same mistakes we had made. We wished them happiness and peace in their new home, hoping the cleansing rituals had been enough to keep the shadows at bay. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a sense of closure. Our connection to that house was finally severed. We had done everything we could to ensure the safety of the new owners, and it was time to move forward. Life continued, and the days grew longer and warmer. Our home was filled with joy and love, a stark contrast to the fear and uncertainty we had once known. We made new memories, celebrated milestones, and cherished the simple moments of everyday life. One evening, as I was tucking Lily into bed, she looked up at me with her big, innocent eyes and asked, "Daddy, do you think the shadows will ever come back?" I smiled and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "No, sweetheart. The shadows are gone. We're safe here, and we always will be." She smiled back, satisfied with my answer, and closed her eyes. I watched her for a moment, my heart swelling with love and relief. Emily joined me in the hallway, and we stood there together, listening to the gentle rhythm of our children's breathing. We had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. The shadows might have been a part of our past, but they no longer held power over us. Our family had found light and love, and that was all we needed. As we turned off the lights and headed to bed, I felt a profound sense of peace. The past was behind us, and the future was bright. We had learned to cherish each moment, to hold each other close, and to never take our happiness for granted. In the end, it wasn't the dark web or the shadows that defined us, but our resilience and the love we shared as a family, and that I knew would always keep us safe. I know it sounds crazy, but I really wanted to find the perfect gift for my wife. You see, my wife, Emily, is absolutely obsessed with flowers. Not just any flowers, but rare and exotic ones. Her passion for botany has always been a significant part of her life, and she can spend hours in our garden tending to her plants. Birthdays, anniversaries, you name it. Flowers are always the way to her heart. As our 5th wedding anniversary approached, I wanted to give her something truly special. I'd already exhausted all the rare flowers available in our local nurseries, and even the specialty stores. That's when I stumbled upon the Middle Mist Red Camellia. This flower is one of the rarest in the world, with only 2 known plants in existence. It was perfect. The only problem? It was nearly impossible to get my hands on one. After scouring the internet for weeks, I finally found a lead. It was buried in a forum where collectors of rare plants exchanged information. One user mentioned that they had seen the Middle Mist Red listed on a certain dark web marketplace. Now, I know what you're thinking. The dark web is a dangerous place, and it's not somewhere a regular guy like me should be venturing. But I was desperate, and my curiosity got the better of me. I spent several nights researching how to access the dark web safely. With a VPN, Tor browser, and a lot of caution, I finally made my way into the depths of the internet. After hours of searching, I found the listing. The price was steep, but I was willing to pay anything to see the look on Emily's face when she received the rarest flower in the world. The listing was simple, almost too simple. No pictures, just a brief description and an email address for contact. I sent an email expressing my interest, and within minutes, I received a response. The seller claimed to have a Middle Mist Red Camellia ready for shipment, but they needed my home address to calculate the shipping costs. It felt off, but I rationalized it. How else were they going to send it to me? After a few more email exchanges, I sent them my address and made the payment using cryptocurrency. I was nervous, but also excited. I couldn't wait to see Emily's reaction. Days passed, and there was no sign of the package. I emailed the seller, but there was no response. I started to think I had been scammed when, finally, a small unmarked box arrived at our doorstep. Inside was a small pot with a delicate, vibrant red flower. The Middle Mist Red Camellia was even more beautiful than I had imagined. I was ecstatic and couldn't wait to surprise Emily. That evening I presented it to her, and the joy and amazement on her face made it all worth it. She was over the moon, carefully inspecting the flower and gushing about its rarity. However, my excitement soon turned to unease. The next day I noticed a black SUV parked across the street from our house. It seemed out of place in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I tried to brush it off as a coincidence, but then I saw it again the following day and the day after that. The same car, different locations, but always within sight of our house. One night I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside our window. I peeked through the curtains and saw a shadowy figure standing by the black SUV. They seemed to be watching our house, but as soon as I moved, they got in the car and drove away. My heart was pounding, but I didn't want to alarm Emily. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. A few days later, things took a turn for the worse. We came home from a dinner date to find our front door slightly ajar. Panic set in as I cautiously pushed the door open and called out. There was no response, but it was clear someone had been inside. Nothing seemed to be missing or out of place except for a small note left on the kitchen counter. It read, "You were lucky no one was home." That was the moment I knew this was more than just paranoia. I told Emily everything, the dark web, the flower, the strange car, and now the break-in. She was understandably upset and scared. We decided we couldn't stay in the house any longer. We packed our bags and booked the first flight out to a city far away, hoping to leave this nightmare behind us. Little did we know the real horror was only just beginning. Leaving our home behind was one of the hardest decisions we ever made. We felt like we were abandoning everything we had built together, but the fear was too great to ignore. We packed light, just the essentials, and I made sure to include Emily's precious Middle Mist red camellia. She insisted it was the one thing that had to come with us. We headed to the airport in the dead of night, thinking it would be safer to move under the cover of darkness. Every shadow seemed to move, and every car that passed felt like it was following us. Our paranoia was at an all-time high, and we kept glancing over our shoulders, expecting the worst. When we finally got to the airport, we parked in the long-term lot, hoping that our car would blend in with the hundreds of others. As we made our way to the terminal, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Emily was visibly shaken, clutching her handbag tightly, with the small pot of the Middle Mist red peeking out. We checked in and went through security without any issues, which helped calm our nerves a bit. But as we sat at our gate waiting for our flight, I saw it. The same black SUV parked outside the terminal, barely visible through the large glass windows. My heart sank. They had followed us. Trying not to panic, I told Emily what I saw. We decided to stick to crowded areas and stay close to airport security. Our flight was called, and we boarded without incident. As the plane took off, I finally started to relax. We were leaving all the fear and anxiety behind, or so I thought. Our destination was a small town in the mountains where we had rented a cabin. It was isolated, quiet, and seemed like the perfect place to lay low until we figured out our next steps. The first few days were blissfully uneventful. Emily and I spent our time hiking, reading, and tending to her new favorite flower. We almost managed to convince ourselves that the danger was behind us. But then, one evening, as the sun was setting behind the mountains, I saw it again. The same black SUV parked at the edge of the forest near our cabin. My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe they had found us. But there it was, plain as day. I told Emily, and we both agreed it was time to leave again. We packed up quickly, deciding to drive to the nearest city and stay in a hotel until we could come up with a better plan. As we drove down the winding mountain roads, the black SUV appeared in our rearview mirror. They were following us, and they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. I pressed the gas pedal harder, trying to put some distance between us, but the SUV matched our speed. The road was narrow and treacherous, with sharp turns and steep drop-offs. My hands were sweating as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to keep control of the car. Emily was on the phone with the police, but the signal was weak in the mountains, and the call kept dropping. The SUV behind us began to inch closer, and I could see the outline of the driver's face in the dim light. He was wearing sunglasses, even though it was almost dark. It was eerie and unsettling. Suddenly the road opened up into a straightaway, and I floored the gas pedal, hoping to outrun them. The SUV did the same, and for a terrifying moment, we were neck and neck. Then, just as we reached the end of the straightaway, a deer darted across the road in front of us. I swerved to avoid it, barely managing to keep the car on the road. The SUV wasn't so lucky. They swerved too, but their tires caught the edge of the road and they skidded out of control, crashing into the trees with a loud thud. I didn't stop to check if they were okay. My only concern was getting Emily and myself to safety. We finally reached the city and found a hotel. We checked in under fake names, paid in cash, and made sure our room was far from any windows or exits. Exhausted, we collapsed onto the bed, holding each other tightly. I could feel Emily trembling, and I knew she was as scared as I was. I promised her we would find a way out of this, but deep down, I wasn't sure how. All I knew was that we had to keep moving, keep running, and hope that one day we'd be able to put this nightmare behind us. The hotel room was a temporary refuge, but it didn't feel safe. Emily and I took turns staying awake, keeping watch over the door and the window. Sleep was elusive, and the fear gnawed at us constantly. I knew we couldn't keep running forever, so I decided it was time to find out who was behind this and why they were targeting us. The first thing I did was get a new laptop and access the dark web again, this time with even more caution. I retraced my steps, looking for any clues I might have missed during my initial search. I combed through forums, reread messages, and tried to track down the seller who had sent me the Middle Mist Red. My emails to them remained unanswered, and their account seemed to have disappeared. Frustrated but determined, I turned my attention to the black SUV. I remembered the partial license plate number and the distinctive dent on the front bumper from the crash. Using various online resources, I managed to trace the vehicle to a rental agency. With some more digging, I found that it had been rented under a fake name, but the credit card used was linked to a series of transactions in the city we had just fled. I started to piece together a timeline and found that these transactions coincided with our movements. It was clear that whoever was behind this had been tracking us for a while. I needed more information, so I decided to reach out to a friend of mine from college, Mike, who worked in cybersecurity. Mike had always been good at uncovering hidden information, and I hoped he could help us. I contacted Mike through an encrypted messaging app and explained our situation. He was shocked but eager to assist. He advised us to stay put while he did some digging. For the next few days, we stayed holed up in the hotel, waiting for Mike's updates and trying to stay under the radar. Emily spent most of her time caring for the Middle Mist Red, which had become a symbol of hope amidst our ordeal. One evening, Mike called with a breakthrough. He had traced the credit card transactions to a shell company linked to an underground organization that specialized in rare and illegal items. This organization had a reputation for ruthlessly protecting their interests, and it seemed that by buying the Middle Mist Red, I had inadvertently attracted their attention. Mike also discovered that they had a history of targeting individuals who accessed their dark web marketplace without proper security measures. My heart sank as I realized the gravity of the situation. I had unknowingly put Emily and myself in grave danger. Mike suggested that we go completely off-grid for a while, at least until he could gather more information and find a way to get these people off our backs. He also advised us to avoid using any electronic devices that could be traced. Following Mike's advice, we left the hotel in the dead of night and headed to a secluded cabin in the woods which Mike had arranged for us. It was far from any towns, and the lack of internet and cell service gave us a strange sense of security. The days were long and quiet, filled with the sounds of nature and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. During our time at the cabin, Emily and I had long conversations about our future. We dreamed of a time when we could live without fear, surrounded by the things we loved. Despite the constant tension, we found solace in each other's company and in the simple beauty of the Middle Mist Red, which continued to thrive. Weeks passed, and one morning Mike called with good news. He had managed to track down a former member of the organization who was willing to help us, in exchange for immunity and a new identity. This informant provided Mike with crucial information about the organization's operations and agreed to testify against them. With this new leverage, Mike worked with law enforcement to set up a sting operation. It was risky, but it was our best shot at ending this nightmare. Emily and I were instructed to stay put and let the authorities handle the rest. The waiting was agonizing, but we held on to the hope that this would soon be over. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mike called to tell us that the operation had been a success. Several key members of the organization had been arrested, and their operations had been dismantled. The threat was over. Emily and I were overwhelmed with relief. We thanked Mike profusely and started to plan our return to a normal life. The experience had changed us, but it had also brought us closer together. We decided to move to a new city, far from our previous home, and start fresh. As we settled into our new life, Emily's love for flowers continued to flourish. She even started a small business selling rare plants, using her expertise to share her passion with others. And in the center of our new garden, the middle mist red camellia stood proudly, a reminder of our resilience and the lengths we would go to for each other. Starting fresh in a new city was both exciting and daunting. Emily and I chose a quaint little town with a vibrant community and a slower pace of life. We found a charming house with a large garden, perfect for Emily's growing collection of rare plants. She quickly set up her new business, and it wasn't long before she gained a reputation as the local plant expert. Despite the tranquility of our new surroundings, the memories of our ordeal lingered in the back of my mind. I often found myself looking over my shoulder, especially when I was alone. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to embrace our new life with more ease, though I could tell she was still haunted by the past. The middle mist red camellia, now thriving in our garden, was a constant reminder of what we had been through. One sunny afternoon, while I was helping Emily repot some plants, we received a visit from an unexpected guest. A man in his early 40s, with a kind face and a gentle demeanor, introduced himself as Detective Jim. He explained that he had been part of the team that worked with Mike to bring down the dark web organization that had targeted us. Detective Jim assured us that the organization was dismantled and that its members were behind bars. However, he also wanted to inform us that a few individuals had managed to evade capture. He didn't want to alarm us, but he felt it was important for us to remain vigilant. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. Just when I thought we were finally safe, the shadows of our past crept back into our lives. Emily tried to stay positive, reminding me that we had overcome so much already, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. A few days later, while I was out running errands, Emily called me in a panic. She had found a small envelope tucked under the garden gate. Inside was a note with just 3 words: "We found you." My heart raced as I rushed home. Seeing Emily's pale face and trembling hands reignited my protective instincts. We called Detective Jim, who arrived promptly with his team. They assured us they would do everything in their power to keep us safe, but the fear was back, gnawing at us. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak and rustle outside made me jump. I kept a watchful eye on the garden, the middle mist red looking almost eerie under the moonlight. Emily sat beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly. The next morning, Detective Jim returned with some promising news. They had traced the note to a local printing shop and found surveillance footage of the person who had printed it. It was a young man, seemingly in his 20s, wearing a hoodie that obscured his face. The police were confident they could track him down. Days turned into weeks, and we tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Emily continued to nurture her plants, and I threw myself into work. We attended community events and made new friends, all while keeping a low profile. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, I noticed a flicker of movement outside the window. I cautiously peeked through the curtains and saw a figure standing at the edge of our garden, staring directly at the house. My blood ran cold. It was the same young man from the surveillance footage. I alerted Emily, and we called Detective Jim immediately. His team arrived swiftly, but the man had vanished into the night. They assured us they would increase patrols in the area and advised us to install a security system, which we did the very next day. Despite the increased security, the sense of unease never fully left us. Every time we ventured out, we were hyper-aware of our surroundings. Our once peaceful garden felt like a stage where unseen eyes could be watching our every move. One afternoon, while Emily was hosting a small gathering for her plant enthusiast friends, I received a call from Mike. He had more news. The young man who had been stalking us was identified as a low-level operative of the dark web organization, one of the few who had slipped through the cracks. Mike assured me that law enforcement was closing in on him and that it was only a matter of time before he was caught. He also advised us to stay strong and not let fear dictate our lives. His words were comforting, but I couldn't help but worry about Emily's safety. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange, Emily and I sat in the garden, surrounded by her beloved plants. The middle mist red camellia stood out, its vibrant red petals glowing in the fading light. Despite everything, we found solace in each other and the beauty of our surroundings. We knew the road ahead would be challenging, but we also knew we were stronger together. Our love had been tested in unimaginable ways, and we had emerged with a deeper bond. As we sat there, holding hands and watching the stars appear in the night sky, we made a silent vow to protect each other and cherish every moment of peace we could find. The days that followed felt like an endless waiting game. Emily and I tried to go about our daily lives, but the tension was palpable. The increased police patrols and the newly installed security system gave us some peace of mind, but the fear still lingered. One morning, as I was making breakfast, Emily came in from the garden, a worried look on her face. She had found another note, this time pinned to the middle mist red. It read, "You can't hide forever." My hands shook as I read the words, and I knew we had to take action. I called Detective Jim immediately, and he arrived within the hour, his expression grim. He examined the note and took it as evidence, promising to ramp up their efforts to find the stalker. He also advised us to stay inside as much as possible and to avoid being alone. That night, as we sat in our living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Emily and I decided to keep watch together, taking turns to rest our eyes while the others stayed alert. The hours dragged on, and just when I thought I might fall asleep, I heard a noise outside. I motioned for Emily to stay put as I crept towards the window. Peering through the curtains, I saw a figure moving in the shadows near the garden. My heart pounded in my chest as I quietly called Detective Jim, whispering our location and the situation. He assured me that backup was on the way and instructed us to stay inside and lock all doors and windows. Emily and I huddled together, waiting for the police to arrive. The minutes felt like hours, and the figure outside continued to move closer to the house. Suddenly, there was a loud crash as the front window shattered. I grabbed a heavy lamp, ready to defend us if necessary. The intruder stepped through the broken window, and for a moment, our eyes locked. It was the young man from the surveillance footage. He seemed startled to see us, and in that split second I saw fear in his eyes. Before he could make another move, the sound of sirens filled the air and he turned to flee. Detective Jim and his team arrived just in time, chasing the young man down and apprehending him. Emily and I watched from the safety of our living room, relief washing over us as the police secured the scene. Detective Jim approached us, his expression a mix of concern and reassurance. "You're safe now," he said, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "We've got him, and we'll make sure he doesn't come near you again." In the days that followed, we learned that the young man was indeed a low-level operative of the dark web organization. He had been acting on his own, desperate to prove himself after the collapse of the group. With his capture, the final remnants of the organization were dismantled, and the threat to our safety was finally over. Emily and I took a deep breath and began to rebuild our lives with a renewed sense of security. The middle mist red, despite all the fear and turmoil it had brought us, remained a symbol of our resilience and love. We decided to keep it as a reminder of our strength and the lengths we would go to protect each other. With the danger behind us, Emily's business flourished. She became a well-known figure in the community, sharing her passion for rare plants and helping others cultivate their own gardens. I found joy in seeing her so happy and at peace. Our garden became a sanctuary, a place where we could relax and enjoy the simple pleasures of life. The middle mist red bloomed brilliantly, its vibrant red petals a testament to our journey and the hope that had carried us through the darkest of times. As we sat together one evening watching the sun set over our peaceful garden, Emily turned to me and smiled. "We made it," she said softly. "We're finally safe." I nodded, pulling her close. "Yes, we are, and we always will be, as long as we have each other." In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of our garden and the love we shared, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, stronger than ever.